My name is Dana Meyers, and I'm 34 years old. Exactly 3 weeks ago, my mother called me. Her voice was unusually cheerful, as if she were about to share wonderful news. But just a few moments later, she said something that shattered my 7-year-old daughter's heart. Dana, we've decided that Emma won't be coming to the wedding. I sat there in stunned silence. For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. Slowly I asked, "You mean she won't be the flower girl anymore?" My mother answered without the slightest emotion.
No.
She won't be attending the wedding at all. My hands began to shake. Emma wasn't just the flower girl. She had been dreaming about that wedding for months. Every evening for the past 2 months, she had put on her lavender dress and practiced tossing flower petals across our hallway. She counted every spin out loud. 1, 2, 3. Then she would laugh at herself. Sometimes she looked up at me with the brightest smile and asked, "Mom, do you think Aunt Bryn will be happy when she sees me?" And every single time I gave her the same answer. "Of course, sweetheart. You're going to be the most beautiful flower girl." What I didn't know was that my own mother had already erased my little girl's name from the guest list. At the time, I was told there had been a necessary change. But the truth was far worse than I could have imagined, and by the time I discovered what my daughter's place at that wedding had actually been traded for, and how much it had cost, it was already too late, because I had already signed a contract to cater the entire wedding reception for 180 guests. Yes, I'm a professional chef, and this wedding was the biggest catering job of my career. I prepared every course with my own hands, every appetizer, every sauce, every dessert, every single plate, exactly as promised in the contract. What I didn't know was that before the night was over, I would also give the wedding a gift, one that no one in that ballroom would ever forget. But to understand that moment, you first have to hear my story from the beginning. You have to meet the girl who spent 17 years setting the table for everyone else. I was 17 years old when my father died suddenly. It was an ordinary Tuesday. He had left for work that morning, but before he even reached the mailbox, he collapsed from a massive heart attack. The ambulance arrived. Neighbors gathered outside. But my father never came home again. That day, I didn't just lose my father. I buried the last piece of my childhood with him. My younger sister, Bryn, was only 10 years old. She cried for days. But my mother, Sylvia, never expressed her grief with tears. She spoke only one language: appearances. Within a month, she created an unspoken rule for our family. No one ever said it out loud, but everyone was expected to obey it. A widow's house must never look like a widow's house. The lawn had to stay perfectly trimmed. The house had to remain spotless. Christmas cards had to be mailed on time. And every family photo had to show 3 smiling faces, even when none of us had a reason to smile. But keeping up that perfect image wasn't free. My father's pension barely covered our expenses. My mother worked part-time at a fabric store. Someone had to grow up long before she was ready. That someone was me. After school, I got a job bagging groceries at the local supermarket. I worked every evening, studied late into the night, then came home to cook dinner, clean the house, and help my little sister with her homework. At 17, I was less of a daughter and more like the second mother of the house. What I didn't realize then was that while I was holding my family together, I was slowly letting my own life slip away, and my first paycheck was just $134. I kept only $5 for myself. The rest, I placed in my mother's hands. She counted the money, never looked up at me, and simply said, "The electricity bill will be higher next month, so you'll need to work more hours." I just nodded. By then, I had already stopped expecting praise. In our house, the words "thank you" simply didn't exist. A few months later, my younger sister, Bryn, decided she wanted to learn the piano. My mother immediately enrolled her in the best music academy in town. The tuition was expensive, but my mother smiled and said, "Bryn has talent. We can't let her future be wasted." I stayed quiet. That same week, I received a letter from a college. I had been awarded a partial scholarship. If I could pay the remaining tuition myself, I would be accepted. I ran home with the letter, excited to tell my mother. She didn't even finish reading it. She glanced at the first page, set it on the table, and said, "Dana, we simply don't have that kind of money." Softly, I replied, "I'll work more hours. I'll earn the rest myself." She answered without hesitation, "If you're working all the time, who's going to take care of this house?" It wasn't a question. It was a decision. I folded the letter, put it in my dresser drawer, and I never took it out again. That night, for the first time, I realized my dreams would always cost more than my family was willing to pay. The years passed. Bryn grew older. Every one of her birthdays was celebrated with a big party. New clothes, expensive gifts, dozens of friends, everything she wanted. My birthdays were different. Most years, no one even remembered the date. And when they did, my mother would simply shrug and say, "Why do you need a birthday cake? You're not a little girl anymore." I would smile, not because I was happy, but because I never had time to cry. Work in the morning, household responsibilities in the evening, more work at night. Eventually, I stopped complaining altogether. When I turned 22, I landed a job as an assistant chef at one of the city's most respected restaurants. For the first time in my life, it felt like a door had finally opened for me. I rushed home to tell my mother. She asked only one question. "How much does it pay?" I told her my salary. She stayed silent for a moment, then nodded. "Good. Now you can contribute even more to the household." I remember asking myself, why did every success in my life always become another obligation? A few years later, I started my own catering business. The beginning wasn't easy. I cooked every meal myself, loaded every delivery myself, and many nights, I stayed up washing dishes long after everyone else had gone to bed. During my first year, I booked only 8 events. The second year, 22. By the third year, business had grown so much that I had to hire 2 employees. People loved my food. Clients started requesting me by name. My calendar filled with bookings. But at home, nothing had changed. Whenever I achieved something, my mother would simply say, "That's nice. But Bryn is at a much more important stage in her life." And if Bryn accomplished even the smallest thing, the entire house celebrated as though she had changed the world. One evening, I looked at myself in the mirror, and for the first time, I realized something. I had spent years helping everyone else build their lives, while I had never truly started living my own. What I didn't know was that very soon, Bryn's wedding would be announced. And with it, the greatest test of my patience was about to begin. Bryn got engaged on a cold winter evening. The house was filled with relatives and friends. Laughter echoed through every room. Everyone was offering congratulations. And for the first time in years, I saw genuine happiness on my mother's face. She stood in the middle of the living room and proudly announced, "My younger daughter's wedding is going to be the most unforgettable wedding of the year." The room erupted in applause. I smiled too, even though something inside me felt strangely quiet. When the celebration was over, my mother walked over to me. For the first time in a long while, her voice was unusually gentle. "Dana, I need to ask you something important." For a moment, I thought she wanted my advice, but her next sentence made it clear. The decision had already been made. "We want you to cater the entire wedding." I paused. This wasn't a small favor. The reception would have 180 guests. I quickly started doing the math in my head. An event that size would require my entire team. The ingredients alone would cost thousands. I'd need extra staff, additional equipment, and several days of preparation. I looked at my mother and quietly asked, "Have you decided on a budget?" She answered immediately, "Your family, who charges their own family full price." I took a slow breath. I had heard those words many times before. Whenever it was time to pay for my work, suddenly, I became family. Keeping my voice calm, I replied, "I'll gladly give you a discount, but I still have employees to pay and ingredients to buy." My mother's expression changed instantly. She frowned. Bryn is your only sister. Are you really going to nickel and dime her? Just then, Bryn walked over with a smile. Dana, if you don't do it, who will? I looked at both of them. Neither of them saw my hard work. They only saw what they needed from me. After a long moment, I finally nodded. All right, I'll cater the wedding, but we'll have a written contract, so everything is clear for both sides. My mother pressed her lips together. She had never liked contracts, because contracts draw a clear line between generosity and being taken advantage of. A few days later, I finished the entire proposal. 6 appetizers, 3 main courses, 4 fresh salads, 2 desserts, and a custom wedding menu. Every detail was written down. When I brought the paperwork to my mother's house, she was sitting in the living room with a few of her friends. She didn't even bother opening the folder. Instead, she smiled and said, I trust you. Just do whatever you think is best. I placed the contract on the table. Even so, I still need your signature. With obvious reluctance, she signed it. At the time, I had no idea that those signatures would become the strongest evidence I would ever have. I left feeling relieved. My staff immediately began preparing for the event. Orders were placed. Ingredients were scheduled for delivery. Every day brought us closer to the wedding. And for a while, I honestly believed, maybe this time, everything would go smoothly. I was wrong, because exactly 3 weeks before the wedding, my phone rang. The screen lit up with my mother's name, and I had no idea that one phone call was about to change my daughter's world forever. I answered the phone immediately. Hi, Mom. Her voice was unusually cheerful. It was the kind of voice she only used when she had already made up her mind. After a few moments of small talk, she said, Dana, I need to ask you a small favor. I smiled. Of course. What is it? There was a brief silence. Then she said the words that stopped my heart. We've decided that Emma won't be attending the wedding. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. I was sure I had misheard her. Slowly, I asked, What do you mean? You mean she won't be the flower girl? She answered without hesitation. No. She won't be coming to the wedding at all. My hands went cold. I stared into space and whispered, But why? What did Emma do wrong? There wasn't a trace of sympathy in my mother's voice. It's nothing personal. We just have to reduce the guest list. I answered immediately. If you need fewer guests, then remove an adult. Why would you take that happiness away from a 7-year-old little girl? My mother let out an impatient sigh. Dana, you're making this far more emotional than it needs to be. I struggled to keep my voice steady. Emma has been preparing for this wedding for 2 months. She practices tossing flower petals every single night. Her dress is already hanging in her closet. My mother's reply was ice cold. Children forget these things quickly. Something inside me broke. She didn't know my daughter at all. Emma wasn't like that. She remembered every promise. She treasured every little moment. I asked one last question. Does Bryn know about this decision? My mother answered without hesitation. Yes. We made the decision together. When the call ended, I sat on the couch for several minutes. I couldn't find a single word. Just then, Emma came running into the room. She was holding her little flower basket. Beaming with excitement, she said, Mom, look, I practiced again. This time I didn't drop a single flower. My throat tightened. I forced a smile. Sweetheart, come sit with me. She climbed onto my lap. Looking up at me with hopeful eyes, she asked, Was that Grandma? Did she say anything about my dress? I gently brushed my fingers through her hair. In that moment, I wished I could stop time. I wished I never had to tell her what I was about to say. Softly, I began, Emma, there's been a small change to the wedding. She looked at me. What kind of change? My eyes filled with tears. Summoning every bit of strength I had, I whispered, Sweetheart, you won't be going to the wedding. She stared at me for several long seconds, trying to understand what I meant. Then, in the quietest voice, she asked, Did I do something wrong? That question cut deeper than anything I had ever heard. I pulled her into my arms.
No.
Absolutely not. You didn't do anything wrong. Silent tears rolled down her cheeks. She hugged the little flower basket tightly and softly asked, "Then why doesn't Aunt Bryn want me there?" I had no answer. I couldn't lie to my daughter, but I couldn't tell her the truth either. That night, I made a decision. I wouldn't let my heartbreak interfere with my work.
I had signed a contract.
I was responsible for preparing dinner for 180 guests, and I intended to honor every promise I had made. What I didn't know was that just 2 days later, I would discover a truth that would change the course of this entire story forever. The next morning, I threw myself into work. My kitchen was busier than ever. One person was chopping vegetables. Another was preparing sauces. Someone else was finishing dessert samples. I kept reminding myself that no matter how much my heart hurt, my professional responsibilities came first. But my thoughts kept drifting back to Emma. When she came home from school that afternoon, she didn't run to pick up her little flower basket like she always did. Instead, she quietly placed it on top of her closet. Then she walked away without saying a word. I stood in the doorway, watching her. Her silence was far more painful than tears. That evening, my phone rang from an unknown number. I answered it. A woman spoke politely. "Is this Dana Meyers?" "Yes, this is Dana." She introduced herself. "My name is Linda Howard. I'm Adam's aunt." Adam was Bryn's fiancé. I frowned slightly. "Of course. How can I help you?" There was a brief pause. Then she said, "I wanted to tell you something. I don't know if anyone has already told you." My heart immediately began to race. "Told me what?" She lowered her voice. "I was at the wedding planning meeting last night. Your daughter's name came up." I sat up straight. And she took a slow breath. No one mentioned reducing the guest list. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Finally, I asked, "What are you trying to tell me?" Linda answered gently. "Your daughter's place was given to another little girl." The pen slipped from my hand. "What?" She continued. "The granddaughter of one of Adam's biggest business partners is going to be the flower girl." I could barely get the words out. "But why?" Her answer was almost impossible to believe. "Because he agreed to pay for all of the wedding flowers. And on top of that, he gave Adam and Bryn an incredibly expensive wedding gift." Everything inside me went still. So it had never been about the guest list. It was a business deal. My 7-year-old daughter's happiness had been traded for an expensive gift. Trying to steady my voice, I asked, "Did Bryn agree to this?" Linda didn't hesitate.
Yes.
The decision was made during the meeting. Your sister even said that building the business relationship would be more valuable in the future. I closed my eyes. Suddenly, I remembered something from years ago. Bryn had fallen off her bicycle as a little girl. She grabbed my hand tightly and asked, "Dana, you'll always be there for me, won't you?" Without thinking, I smiled and answered, "Always." I had kept my promise, but somewhere along the way, she had forgotten hers. After the call ended, I sat in silence for several minutes. The contract folder lay on the table in front of me. It carried both my mother's signature and Bryn's. I slowly closed the folder. I knew this was no longer just about a wedding. It had become a test of trust, integrity, and truth. Even so, I made one final decision. I would fulfill every obligation I had agreed to. Every course, every plate, every promise, exactly as written in the contract. Because my profession had taught me something important. Someone else's dishonesty should never define my character. But deep inside, I made another promise to myself. If the right moment ever came to tell the truth, I would not stay silent. What I didn't know was that moment would arrive on the wedding day, in front of every single guest. 1 week before the wedding, my kitchen was running day and night. The final shopping list had been completed. Fresh vegetables, premium cuts of meat, imported spices, special ingredients for the desserts. Everything had arrived right on schedule. My entire team was working tirelessly. I personally inspected every single detail, because I had always believed that my reputation was built on the quality of my work. When I returned home, I found Emma sitting quietly in her room. The lavender dress she had planned to wear to the wedding was lying on the bed in front of her. She gently ran her fingers across the fabric. I stood silently in the doorway, watching her. After a few moments, without even looking at me, she asked, "Mom, will I ever get to wear this dress?" I didn't have an answer. I walked over and sat beside her. Then I wrapped my arms around her. She rested her head on my shoulder without saying another word. That day, we hardly spoke, but our silence said more than words ever could. 2 days later, my mother called again. She spoke as though nothing had happened. "Dana, everything is ready for the wedding, isn't it?" I answered briefly. "Almost everything." Without missing a beat, she said, "There can't be any mistakes. Adam has some very important guests attending." I was quiet for a moment. Then I calmly replied, "My daughter was very important to me, too." Silence filled the line. A few seconds later, my mother's voice turned cold. "Dana,
Forget about that.
this is Bryn's big day." For the first time, I answered her without backing down. I can't treat my daughter's humiliation as something to simply forget. She spoke sharply. "If you cause any problems at this wedding, remember this: the family will never forgive you." I remained calm. "I will fulfill every obligation in my contract. As for everything else, time will decide." Then I ended the call. That same evening, an envelope was delivered to my office. There was no return address. I opened it. Inside were several documents related to the wedding planning. There was also a receipt. It clearly showed that every dollar for the wedding flowers had been paid by Adam's business partner, Richard Collins. Attached to the receipt was a handwritten note. It contained only one sentence: "His granddaughter will be the flower girl, as agreed." I read the note once. Then I read it again. And then a third time. There was no room left for doubt. It wasn't a rumor. It was written proof. My daughter's place had been traded to strengthen a business relationship. I carefully placed every document into a folder. Then I locked it inside the filing cabinet at my office. I knew acting out of anger would only hurt me. I had to wait for the right moment. The day before the wedding, every dish had been prepared. Everything met the standards I demanded of myself. One of my employees looked at me and asked, "Chef, are you really going to that wedding?" I smiled gently.
Yes.
"I'll be there, because I made a promise, and I never break my promises." But deep inside, another promise had already taken shape. If the right moment came to tell the truth, this time, I would not stay silent. And the very next day, inside that wedding ballroom, that was exactly what was about to happen. The wedding day had finally arrived. By 5 o'clock that morning, I was already at the venue with my entire team. The kitchen was alive with activity. Massive pots simmered on the stoves. The ovens had been running for hours. Every workstation had a detailed schedule. What dish had to be prepared, when it had to be served, and in what order. Everything had been planned down to the minute. I personally inspected every detail: the flavor, the temperature, the presentation. Nothing could be less than perfect. After all, my company's reputation was on the line. By early afternoon, the guests began to arrive. Elegant dresses, perfectly tailored suits, beautiful decorations, smiling faces everywhere. As I stepped out of the kitchen, my eyes fell on a little girl. She was dressed in white, holding a basket filled with flower petals. She was the child who had taken Emma's place. I watched her for a few moments. She looked innocent. None of this was her fault. The blame belonged to the adults. Without saying a word, I returned to the kitchen. The ceremony began right on time. Bryn and Adam exchanged rings. The guests applauded. Photos were taken. Laughter filled the ballroom. And I continued working alongside my team. The appetizers were served. Then the second course. Then the main dinner. Every guest praised the food. Several people stopped my staff to ask, "Who prepared this incredible meal?" Every one of them gave the same answer: Chef Dana Meyers. I wasn't looking for compliments. I simply wanted to fulfill my responsibility. As evening settled in,
Dessert was served.
now only the wedding cake remained. The lights in the ballroom dimmed. The band began playing soft music. Every guest turned toward the cake. At that moment, I looked across the room. My mother and Bryn looked happier than ever. There was complete satisfaction on their faces. They truly believed everything had gone exactly as planned. What they didn't know was that inside my bag were the documents that could expose every lie they had told. I quietly opened my bag, pulled out the folder, and looked through the papers one last time. The receipt, the handwritten note, and the contract, bearing their own signatures. I closed the folder again. My hands weren't shaking. Yes, I was angry, but I felt something even stronger.
Peace.
Because I knew I wasn't about to seek revenge. I was simply going to tell the truth. Just then, the master of ceremonies made an announcement. Now we'd like to invite the bride's mother to say a few words. My mother walked onto the stage. With a bright smile, she praised Bryn and spoke about what a perfect day it had been. The audience applauded warmly. When she finished, she returned to her seat. A few moments later, the ballroom fell silent. I reached for the spoon resting beside my glass, then gently tapped the rim.
Clink, clink, clink.
Every conversation stopped. 180 guests
turned to look at me.
I took a deep breath, held the folder firmly in my hand, and slowly began walking toward the stage. I knew the next 3 minutes would not only change the ending of a wedding, they would expose years of lies and change every relationship in that room forever. The ballroom was completely silent. In my hands, I held nothing but a glass and a folder. I walked onto the stage, placed the microphone in front of me, and for a few long moments, I said nothing. Every guest in the room was watching me with curiosity. Confusion spread across my mother's face. Bryn sat there with a faint smile. She probably assumed I was about to offer a simple wedding toast. I leaned toward the microphone and spoke softly. First of all, I'd like to congratulate the bride and groom on the beginning of their new life together. I sincerely hope that every decision they make will always be guided by honesty and respect. A few guests applauded politely. I paused for a moment, then continued. Today, I'm not standing here only as the chef who prepared this meal. I'm standing here as a mother. The room became even quieter. I looked directly at my mother, then at Bryn. 3 weeks ago, my 7-year-old daughter, Emma, was removed from this wedding. We were told that the guest list had to be reduced. Several guests exchanged puzzled glances. I opened the folder and took out the first document. Later, I discovered that the guest list was never reduced. Instead, one little girl's place was simply given to someone else. Whispers began spreading through the ballroom. Bryn's smile disappeared. My mother shifted uncomfortably in her chair. I lifted another document. This is the receipt for the wedding flowers. It shows that the entire floral arrangement was paid for by one of Adam's business associates, and in return, his granddaughter was given the role of flower girl. I held the receipt high enough for the guests in the front rows to see. The room fell into complete silence. I wasn't making accusations. I was simply presenting the truth. Then I spoke again. I have no anger toward the little girl who served as the flower girl today. She is completely innocent. She had no part in this decision. The responsibility belongs to the adults who traded one child's happiness for a business advantage. An elderly woman slowly lowered her head. Several guests looked, visibly shocked. I closed the folder. Then I looked at my mother. If you had simply told me the truth, it still would have hurt.
But you chose to lie.
And, in the end, the lie caused far more pain than the truth ever could. My mother opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. I turned to Bryn. She couldn't even meet my eyes anymore. Calmly, I said, I prepared every dish at this wedding with complete professionalism, because my character is not defined by someone else's choices. I kept every promise I made.
Now,
I simply ask that you take responsibility for yours. I placed the microphone back on its stand. I never raised my voice. I never insulted anyone. I never caused a scene. I simply told the truth. And sometimes, the quiet truth is far more powerful than the loudest accusation. As I stepped down from the stage, the entire ballroom remained silent. But I could feel this wasn't the silence before a storm. It was the silence that comes when people are forced to confront their own conscience. That I slowly stepped down from the stage. The entire ballroom was silent. A silence so deep that everyone seemed to be trying to process the truth they had just heard. A few moments later, an elderly woman sitting at the front table stood up. She looked at me and slowly began to clap. Then another table joined in. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was filled with applause. I had never expected that kind of reaction. I didn't speak to be praised. I only wanted to tell the truth. That was all. Without looking at anyone, I placed the folder back into my bag and walked toward the kitchen. Behind me, the guests continued whispering among themselves. A short while later, the event coordinator came to me. With genuine respect, he said, "Ms. Meyers, your work was exceptional. The guests can't stop praising the food." I simply smiled and thanked him. Just then, Adam, the groom, approached me. The regret on his face was obvious. In a quiet voice, he said, "I'm sorry. I had no idea that Emma was treated this way." I calmly replied, "If you're truly sorry, then never allow a child's happiness to be sacrificed for someone's benefit." He lowered his head silently. A few minutes later, Bryn came and stood in front of me. Her eyes were red. Softly, she said, "Dana, I only wanted a perfect wedding. I never thought things would go this far." For the first time, I looked at her seriously. Then I said, "Every wrong decision starts as a small compromise, but the price is often paid by someone innocent." She remained silent. She had no answer. At that moment, my mother walked over to us. She looked at me, but she also had nothing to say. She stood there for a few seconds, then quietly walked away. After that day, she never contacted me again. Many people believe that was the biggest ending of the story. But the truth was something completely different. The real ending came a few weeks later. Many guests who attended the wedding were so impressed by my food that they hired my company for their own events. Within 6 months, my catering business received more orders than it had received during the first 2 years combined. I also signed a permanent contract with a major hotel. My company became more successful than ever before. And the most beautiful moment came a few months later. I looked at Emma and said, "Sweetheart, next week we're going to a very special event." She looked at me with curiosity. "What kind of event?" I smiled. "A charity organization's annual celebration. And this time, you're going to be the flower girl." The light returned to her eyes. The same light that had disappeared after that painful phone call. She happily pulled out the same lavender dress, the one that had been sitting untouched in her closet for months. That day, as she scattered flowers down the aisle, she never stopped smiling. And in my heart, I learned something important. Sometimes, life takes away one special moment from you, but in return, God gives you dignity, peace, and opportunities you never imagined. Today, my mother still doesn't speak to me. My relationship with Bryn is almost non-existent, but I don't hate them, because hatred only keeps a person trapped. I forgave them, but I also made a promise to myself that I would never again compromise my own dignity. And if you ask me, what was the most valuable thing I gained from this entire experience? My answer is simple. The truth may take time to come out, but the truth always finds a way to win. If you enjoyed Dana's story, and you want to listen to more emotional stories like this, stories that reveal the struggles of family, betrayal, sacrifice, and the power of truth, then make sure to subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and share the story with your friends and family. Your small support gives us the motivation to bring you more powerful and heartfelt stories. See you in the next story.